Hey guys, what's going on? This is Brad from the Ad Army, and today, as you can tell, we are talking about Godzilla Minus Zero. And I actually am making this video as a spur of the moment because I was thinking about doing something for Godzilla Day. It just time got away from me because I've started a new job. But I have looked at the promotional material for Godzilla Minus Zero, and I was really happy and excited. However, I saw the theory, and also shouts to, I think it's D-Man 1954, doing great Godzilla work. But the point is, I just watched his video not too long ago of I think it was not too long ago for a dinner, but the point is, this I'm making it in a rush. Point is, I watched the video about the theories of all the creatures that Godzilla could be fighting in Godzilla Minus Zero. Is there going to be a villain? And I actually found something pretty interesting that I didn't see addressed in the video, and I was trying to find online, but I haven't made enough time to look. But I'm pretty sure this will be the first one focusing on it. But I might know, and I'm just saying as a guess, I might know what the actual characters or villains or opponents will be for Godzilla in Minus Zero. Now, obviously, I'm just speculating, but there's something that I noticed that's a bit different than I think what a lot of people were projecting, and something got me thinking. So everybody's trying to draw some type of conclusion or looks from the promotional material, just the symbol and the logo of Minus Zero, and a lot of things can be inferred. I think one of the great ones I saw was Hedorah. I actually thought Hedorah would make some sense unless they're going to go with maybe some type of more realism concept of maybe what's wrong with Noriko. However, I saw an amazing theory or part of the video where the theory is there's a woman praying, and I can kind of see it now in the logo. You can kind of see that there's a woman kneeling and her hands are down. However, if I were to take the projection of where it's aiming, right, in terms of the direction of the lady praying, she's praying towards the minus sign and the two O's or the two zeros, and there's this, obviously the period. So I actually saw part of the theory as well where it said maybe the little line or the minus sign is actually supposed to be the Shinden, which is the actual fighter from the original Minus One, right, from Minus One. And at first I thought about this conceptually, right, because if you could tell by my title, it was kind of clickbaity, but I think this actually works. Is that I think it might actually be Mothra, and by extension of what you could tell, the Mothra larvae taking on Godzilla. Now, if you're wondering how we could figure this out, what type of situation could the story revolve around, there's a lot that could be done, but the reason why I'm drawing the conclusion just from the look is actually, if you think about it in a different way, the Shinden could be, in theory, being the plane headed in the direction of whatever the two circles or the zeros are, and there's something in the middle. Now, if you look at most of the promotional material or any of the films where the two Mothra larvae have been present, you will almost always notice that there's the two larvae and the fairies that are usually associated with them in the middle. Now, I do think that this is usually a core element of Mothra when we talk about Mothra in terms of the original, all the other eras of Mothra. However, I do think with the approach of maybe Toho wanting to take some of the classic monsters and actually give them more realistic approaches to the series, at least specifically in the Minus One universe, I could actually see that this might be a literal representation. So what I mean is, if you think about how big the Mothra larvae are, right, they're humongous, right? They're supposed to be titanic creatures. So in theory, in the middle, if someone was there, this could actually be, in theory, it could be Noriko, it could be anyone. But the point is, they are about the size of the fairies in proportions to the actual Mothra larvae, right? So if you think about it in a weird way, you could look at it as the woman who's praying, maybe it is usually associated with Mothra being summoned, people praying for a savior, and the two Mothra larvae are actually the ones who respond, or maybe Mothra responds if it's a redux of Godzilla versus Mothra, right? You could see a lot here. But my main opinion here would be that it would actually make a lot of sense if this is the case and Mothra is the creature facing Godzilla, because I do think that if Godzilla Minus Zero goes the route that Godzilla Minus One did, there is a chance that this is supposed to be more of a psychological concept, because if you were to think about it from the last movie, right, the characters just dealt with this monstrosity, right, that was wrecking Japan. They defeated Godzilla, roughly, and they were under the impression that this should be enough. But what if you throw in the middle that the Godzilla comes back and obviously their weapons didn't work? This could lead to many things. If you want to bring in the Oxygen Destroyer, you totally could. But I do think that this could lead to the first monster battle being a more of a problem for the people of Japan, wondering about trust. Because you do know, or we do know for the time period that will be taking place for minus zero, there is a good chance that this could be a way of bridging the concept of, global trust, because obviously this is post World War II. So you could have a situation where a lot of the nations, specifically America, which was mentioned and featured heavily in minus one to the beginning aspect, could be that they haven't fully obviously given their full trust over to Japan as a nation at this time period, but they're still supplying them with aid, and they didn't help them really against the minus one situation with Godzilla. They basically let Japan handle it. So we could see this being another situation where maybe they try again to stop Godzilla the same way. It doesn't work. It could be a pretty bad situation. This is just theoretical, right? But the point is, Mothra could be a more of a natural savior. So what I think could happen, if we want to go about it in a few ways, so I am getting a little off tangent, but the point is, for this being the possible way of encountering Godzilla and Mothra, is that maybe Godzilla is actually hunting specifically, maybe Noriko hunting maybe specifically Shikishima, and you're wondering, well, why would they be hunted? Well, if you think about it like this, if you want to take into consideration what happened to Noriko with the thing growing on her neck, you could look at it as maybe Godzilla senses that there's another of his species or something along those lines, wondering where that piece of him is, and maybe he can sense it and he's after it, right? Almost like how pigeons are homing beacons to certain places, like they know where to go. Maybe it's a similar thing where Godzilla's hunting specifically Noriko because it believes there's another Godzilla. So one thing is maybe they're trying to cure what's going on in her neck. I mean, these are just obviously possibilities here, but maybe they're trying to cure what's on her neck. It doesn't work, and maybe they find that there is a way to cure it, but it's only some type of specific stuff. I know this gets a little bit science fiction-y, but at the time period, it would actually fit a bit where they're like, we need to try to find a way to cure her, and nothing's working. So maybe they try to do like natural remedies, and maybe the only island they could think of for natural remedies might be an introduction to Infant Island. And you could do this. It would kind of work. I think the more interesting thing would be, well, why would the battle take place over there and then go back to Japan? It could be the fact that maybe this also takes into account more of the nuclear aspect of Mothra, where Mothra, in theory, is a guardian creature at the time period of the original Mothra and Godzilla vs. Mothra series, but maybe the nuclear weapons have also affected the island. So maybe Mothra actually is a result of nuclear testing, very much so like Godzilla, but instead of taking its vengeance and rage out on humans, it decides to, maybe protect them or aid them. Or in this case, maybe Godzilla goes to the island, it enters battle with Mothra hunting down Noriko. This could be the fact of like maybe Godzilla's featuring as it's continued like a predator, like a monster. It's hunting down this specific thing that it's sensing in Noriko because it wants it to be, dominant, all that stuff like it was doing in minus one. But this leads into conflict against Mothra. We can have Mothra being defeated, and then obviously we have the situation where maybe Shikishima and Noriko escape Infant Island, or however they want to approach this, and then Godzilla ends up heading back to Japan, but because Godzilla destroyed Mothra, we can get the situation where it has an egg, and you still get it, and you still get the two, Mothra larvae coming. And the point of it would be, maybe there's a point where Godzilla's gonna get Noriko and Shikishima, there's nowhere left to run, and she prays. And luckily her prayers get heard, maybe in, quotations, right? Like maybe she's just hoping because there's nothing left to do, and the Mothra larvae attack Godzilla. I'm still trying to figure out if maybe what the approach would be is that Mothra larvae, maybe they subdue Godzilla, but they don't kill Godzilla, and then the oxygen destroyer is deployed against Godzilla in this movie. Because I could see something where, I always forget the professor's name, but our scientist friend from the first film is maybe in a hot debate of trying to create a weapon, and I'd love the introduction of Dr. Serizawa in this film, if maybe he's like a radical who understands about the situation. Maybe he's friends with our doctor friend, trying to moving the goalpost of 1954 or whatever back to whatever the time period is, maybe early 50s, and having this situation where he tells his friend that he may have a way to kill Godzilla, but he won't reveal this. So we could have the oxygen destroyer being revealed pretty much like it was in 1954 in the original film, but then having the same deployment of Serizawa deciding that he needs to deploy the weapon against Godzilla and maybe killing Godzilla in Tokyo Bay, hoping that the oxygen destroyer probably does it. And if there is not intending to be a sequel to minus one, I could kind of see the film being a more of Shikishima and maybe Noriko getting over their fear of Godzilla in different ways, maybe more of Shikishima's thing being the fear of monsters, as Mothra could be used, or both the larva or Mothra could be depicted as maybe being the helpful monsters, quote unquote, but like they're not really helpful. They're just stopping Godzilla because Godzilla's causing harm to their territory and whatnot, that type of situation, but also establishes the more psychological issues that Shikishima had to put trust in these creatures that he was already, basically been fighting since the last movie. And although he conquered his own PTSD and got over what happened to a degree, he wasn't able to get over the fact that another monster could come and be helpful. That would maybe be his dilemma in the movie, where Noriko's is her fear of Godzilla after she basically survived. Well, she did survive the attack at Ginza. You could start to see that there's so much that you can actually compile for the story that the Mothra situation could work. And another thing too is from -1 to -0 in theory could work, because if you think about it, right, we're going down instead of up. So -2 would have made sense because maybe the category got more dangerous. If it's -0, meaning the category technically got lifted in terms of being less difficult for Japan or something, we could argue that maybe the reason why is there's something that tipped the scales back into the favor of humanity to a degree, that being maybe the larva and Mothra, and you start to see that the scales tip back, and there's a big, I think, possibility that this could work. It's more or less dependent on, what actually their goal is, but I can definitely see something like this being a possibility as to explain and keep Godzilla as a villain. It could kind of explain maybe if all the theories think that, because I do know that there were supposed to be more Easter eggs headed towards -0 instead of like -1, because it didn't really have much Easter eggs, but they definitely said they wanted more. So I could definitely see this being maybe a concept for -0, being that the goal is they have to it's like mostly putting trust in things that you can't control. As I think ultimately this would just be a possible way to interpret it. Like I said, I could be wrong, but I actually see this being a pretty, solid way of working it, because I think a realistic Mothra actually is kind of obvious if you just take away the infant island fairies. Like if you really take them away, it kind of makes sense, because you could just look at it as, if you look at the original Mothra, the movie, Mothra was just trying to, hatch out and then grow into its, full form, or imago, I think is the technical, or imago is technically the other form. But the point is, you could just have Mothra growing, turning into its full grown form, and then, yeah, you could argue that a giant moth that flying around is pretty dangerous, and pretty much for a realistic, Godzilla series, or realistic Godzilla anything. I think a giant moth flying around any big city would be dangerous, because it just blow things away without trying if it's flying, stuff like that. And I do think that if you're trying to interpret a realistic Mothra, it's actually not as difficult if you just look at it from the aspect of, hey, if one of those things was gigantic moving around the city, it'd probably not be safe for us, right? And that's kind of how I'm looking at it. If people are like, well, maybe it's too far out there, I think even something like Ghidorah was kind of pitched, and I'm like, I think Ghidorah could work, but I don't think for this film. If maybe they want to like speculate, having a third film and a trilogy would really kind of work if they were like, oh, well, some threats are coming from even beyond Earth. Then you could have Godzilla. I don't think Godzilla would ever like change from being a heel, because he's supposed to be a bad guy in this universe solidly, and I think that's the right choice. But you could have it being where Godzilla becomes like the immovable force, and the invincible, like a movable force meets an immovable object. The point of it being that Godzilla is a constant, no matter how much they try to get rid of him or hurt him. Because I think this film could show that even when the scales tip in the favor of humanity, Godzilla still leaves a wrath of himself. Like maybe Godzilla is defeated in this film, or maybe the oxygen destroyer hurts him, but it makes him even stronger for a third film, and we finally get Ghidorah appearing. I could kind of see maybe a team up of sorts happening, but if they wanted to continue the story further, that would be more like figuring out what the film wants to cover, because I think -0 has to cover a specific theme first for it to make sense for all of us. And personally, I think this is where I draw my line in the sand for my theory video, because pretty much this is more of just from what I see in terms of the logo, if there's Easter eggs here, but also what I believe could be the plot points going into the film, because the -1 film was so focused on character developments and growth, but also kind of balancing out the monster aspect. It's really interesting to have another monster take into space without dominating the whole film. So to get the writing perfect, I think this is just one of the possible ways, because the logic would be that the Mothra doesn't serve the purpose it does in the other films, but it's more of how people interpret what Mothra is doing as the actual, maybe the conundrum of the film. Can monsters be good? And then also in the case of the others, can humanity balance itself if another force reaches out? Like, every character can have their own development. I can see a lot of things going on. Also, is the oxygen destroyer going to be in play, unless they're preparing for like a third film, if the second film does really well, which I think it probably will no matter what the options are. If the oxygen destroyer if they want to put the oxygen destroyer in play now, do they want to save it in case there's a third film? I mean, there's just a lot going on, and I think for the -1 universe so far, I think there's many ways they can go, but this is just my opinion. I do hope maybe I'm right, because if I am, I'd just be like, well, I know my Godzilla well, but I could be wrong. The -1 and the 0.0 and -1 didn't necessarily equate to anything, so there's a lot of things that could point to maybe -0 not equating to anything, and I'm just looking into it too much. But if there are Easter eggs and this is the direction they go, I would love to see Mothra return. I think it's been so long since I think we've seen actual, like, a Toho Mothra in Japanese on, like, big screen. That'd be so cool. But yeah, I'm gonna close out here, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. If you think I'm off base, completely fine. If you think I'm on base, completely fine. If you like Godzilla as a whole, we all win, so we're all on base. That's great. And yeah, let me know down below what you think. And as always, this has been Brad from the Ed Army signing off, and for all of you out there, to sign on.